Okay, we shall proceed, right? Okay. Today we are going to talk about socially engaged Buddhism in Vietnam. There are two good reasons that required us to study about socially engaged Buddhism in Vietnam. Firstly, because this particular area was very much influenced by Chinese Buddhism, and in some way, is socially engaged Buddhism derived inspiration from China. And another reason we need to study about engaged Buddhism in Vietnam is because uh, Vietnam went through a very tragic period of our human history, the Vietnam War, which lasted from the year 1955 to 1975, 19 years. So it was a human tragedy that inflicted sufferings not only on the Vietnamese and the Americans as well, and also on Buddhism itself. And from there, the anti-war campaigns by Buddhists uh, came forth and was later on described by many scholars as socially engaged Buddhism in Vietnam. During that war, 1955, end of 1955 to the beginning of to April 1975, 19 years, altogether about 1 million lives were lost in this war. During the peak period, America stationed 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. And of course, the Vietcong, the North Vietnamese, they have another about 800,000 people on the ground. So it was a great human tragedy that inflicted a lot of sufferings to people, not only in Vietnam, but also America, Korea, Philippines. All those countries also sent some soldiers, and a lot of lives were lost. And when I was a kid, we used to see a lot of American soldiers or Australian soldiers or the New Zealand soldiers taking their holidays in Penang Island. That was when we first had a good look at white people. So for these two main reasons, we cannot miss talking about socially engaged Buddhism. But before I proceed further, I would like to thank Toshita for bringing up the issue of sex and movement. And therefore, I rush up this slide this morning. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Hear you. Okay. Why is it I'm not seeing anything else? Okay.
Well, you don't have your screen shared or anything.
You hear? Do you see the screen?
No, you're not sharing your screen yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's why I see something's not right. Okay, I was looking at my own screen and talking away. That's the problem with modern technology. Okay, I will share screen now. Where is my share screen? Do you see?
Yeah, I think you're just sharing a segment of it, though, not your entire screen. Here, I'm going to stop your screen share.
I have to stop and do again.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see. It still does not appear. Do you see anything?
I see some, but it's just like just the top left-hand corner.
Top left-hand corner.
Yeah, it's not sharing the entire screen. What happens if you click from the beginning or start the slideshow?
Okay, let me stop and share again. Okay. There's something not right.
Here.
Do you see clearer now?
No, it's something's not right. When you're sharing the screen, how are you sharing it? Like, there you go. That's what you want. All right.
You get it now?
Yeah.
Oh, because okay, now do you get a better view?
Yeah, now it's proper.
Okay, it's perfect. All right, thank you. Okay, now we can go on. Yesterday, Toshita brought up a question about the various sects and movement. So this morning, I brush up 2 more slides just to clarify this point, which is coincidentally actually very much related to what we are going to discuss this morning. You see, when we talk about Theravada or Mahayana or Vajrayana, these are religious sects that that formed mainly because of differences on teachings, and of course on those teachings some practices also differ. So Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana are mainly religious sects. Okay. For example, in Theravada you have certain Buddhist texts, whereas in Mahayana you have some other Buddhist texts which you can't find in the Theravada. Okay, so the differences mainly on the teachings. Okay, whereas when we talk about humanistic Buddhism, we are talking about an approach or a movement to introduce the Buddhism, whether it's Theravada, Mahayana, or Vajrayana. It is an approach or a movement to introduce Buddhism, whether it's Theravada, Mahayana, or Vajrayana, to the masses. So this approach, when it was first introduced in China, it was termed humanistic Buddhism. It's a humanistic Buddhism approach. And this term is less used in the West. In the West, the term that is most commonly used is socially engaged Buddhism, or today simply engaged Buddhism. So if you come across articles in the West, they would mention quite often the word engaged Buddhism, but less about humanistic Buddhism. But we will see in probably in the next few slides that actually they have some connections, but not entirely the same. Then if you look at Tai Chi and Ning Sun, they were trying to present Mahayana Buddhism by emphasizing on the humanistic Buddhism. So when Tai Chi talked about the 5 vehicles, Yin Sun talked about the 5 vehicles, they were all talking about Mahayana Buddhism, but with the emphasis that we should spend our energy on the human realm or matters related to our human life. But as I mentioned to you earlier, when we were talking about Tai Chi and Yin Sun, they were both talking more on the descriptive aspect, and that is they define for us what humanistic Buddhism is about. But how humanistic Buddhism as a movement that is translated on the ground, we call it the normative aspect. On the ground, the normative aspect is different. So when you have social services, oh, or we are engaged with public issues. So when we say socially engaged, we are talking about engagement with public issues, whether it's with the government or non-government, and any engagement with the public issues. We are dealing with issues on the societal level, not our own individual self. And these kind of things also happen to the non-Mahayana sect. So if you look at the Theravada groups, don't tell me the Theravada groups don't emphasize on humanistic aspect. In fact, they emphasize much more from the original Theravada teaching. And they did the same thing when they try to provide social services on the ground. And later on, we shall see, let's say in Sri Lanka, is predominantly Theravada Buddhism, but they also engage with the government or on the anti-colonial powers. So they were also humanistic in that sense. But this, I call it the characteristics, but they had got nothing to do with Tai Chi or Yin Sun. And sometimes this kind of movement, let's say in Sri Lanka, is given a different name. In some scholars call it Protestant Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Some just simply call the monks involved political monks. So the term socially engaged Buddhism that today we use on Sri Lanka actually came much later. So we need to differentiate between the cause and the effect. Which one comes first? Okay. So I hope this clarifies that humanistic Buddhism is a movement that cuts across all the sects, Mahayana, Theravada, or Vajrayana. Okay. And perhaps I go to the next screen so that we can. Yesterday we shared. So humanistic Buddhism, or today I doubt is influential. I also use the term modern Buddhism. So humanistic Buddhism, as I mentioned to you just now, on the ground there are two major aspects. One is socially engaged. The other one is social services on the ground. So this can happen to Mahayana or to Theravada or Vajrayana and things like that. Okay? And later on, if you are particularly inclined, you want to know about left wing and right wing. Okay? So today we want to talk about engaged Buddhism in Vietnam. Okay, here we talk about the advent of the term socially engaged Buddhism. The Vietnamese term Nak Kien Pak Kiao renders the Chinese term Ren Jian Fo Jiao. So if you come across Vietnamese term Nak Kien Pak Kiao, actually is the same as the Chinese term. For that matter, Vietnamese words when spoken is very much similar to Hokkien language, the Fujian language in China. So you can, if you are clever enough and you know Hokkien, I'm a Hokkien, you can sometimes figure out what they are trying to say. For example, we talk about safety. Then in Vietnamese, it's called an toàn. In Hokkien, it's called an chuan. So there are quite a lot of similarities. Okay. So essentially, Ren Jian Fo Jiao or humanistic Buddhism is the Buddhism that places emphasis on this worry, on this life. Okay, this life. Now, this concept of this worry emphasized on this word was rendered into French word by Thich Nhat Hanh. Vietnam was a French colony, and early Vietnamese were quite well versed with Vietnamese language. So Thich Nhat Hanh, he knows Vietnamese language, so he took the concept from Tai Chi, who talk about this worry. So he rendered this word as Le Bouddhisme engagé in French. And this word later on be translated into English, become socially engaged Buddhism, or just engaged Buddhism. So Thich Nhat Hanh was actually said to be the first person to introduce this term to the West. And that's why the West is very much more familiar with him. Actually, Thich Nhat Hanh already read Tai Chi and Ying Sun's work by 1960. When he was presented with a CD of Ying Sun, he said, "This is the monk I revere most." So we can see that Thich Nhat Hanh in some way was very much influenced by Ying Sun. And also, Ying Sun's work was also translated into Vietnamese in the 1980s. But this was much later. But by the way, some of the early Vietnamese, before the language was changed, before the writings was changed to today's Romanized writings, the Vietnamese writings was actually Chinese writing, like kanji in Japan or the Korean writings. So a lot of the early Vietnamese were able to read Chinese. So it is said that Thich Nhat Hanh could speak Chinese. I'm not sure whether he really could speak Chinese. People said he could speak Chinese and Japanese. So I tested him once when he was in Kuala Lumpur. I spoke to him in Chinese and he just stared at me. So I think he could not understand Chinese very well, but he might be able to read some Chinese words because the early generation of Vietnamese could read some Chinese writings. So historically speaking, Buddhism in Vietnam was influenced by Chinese Buddhism, and the Humanistic Buddhism of China had similar influence on the Vietnamese. So just now we saw the word left-wing Buddhism. So this scholar Liu Yiquang, Y.K. Liu, that we talked about yesterday, he translated this word engaged Buddhism into left-wing Buddhism. Why he did so? Well, scholars have a lot of time to do all this kind of research and come out with new terms. Okay, so if you come across the word left-wing Buddhism, which is still not very popular use, but one day will emerge. Now, engaged Buddhism tends to be associated with the active political involvement of monks during the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. So that's where I make a differentiation between engaged Buddhism and humanistic Buddhism. So engaged Buddhism, very much more politically involved with the public issues, whereas the normal humanistic Buddhism, we talk about social services, building hospitals, building schools, provide financial aid. And those people, some people in the socially engaged Buddhism say this is the bandage service, you know. Whereas here we are trying to cure the disease. Here you are trying to give some kind of Panadol. So now we look at Thich Nhat Hanh. When we talk about socially engaged Buddhism, we can't miss him simply because he was the man who used this term to justify all his actions of anti-war during the Vietnamese War. He was born in 1926, so this year he is 84 now, or more than that. By 2026, he will be 100 years old. So now he is 94. Okay, 94. You notice most of the monks live very long. You know, so if you like to live long, perhaps you should consider becoming monks or nuns. Okay. Hi, Venerable Xing Ying now also 90 something. Okay, Ying Sun lived until 99. And this Thich Nhat Hanh already today is 94. Okay. He actually studied the secular subject at the University of Saigon. Okay. And during the Vietnam War, most of the monks have a big dilemma. They have a dilemma whether they want to continue their life of meditation in the monastery or to help those around them suffering under the bombings and the turmoil of war. So some chose to continue to meditate, whereas Thich Nhat Hanh chose both. He would conduct demonstration in such a way that while you are demonstrating, you need not sharp slogans like what most demonstrators could do, but just to walk quietly, or meditating while walking, with walking meditation to demonstrate your points. So he combined both, and the idea of your meditation must eventually be able to serve the masses. So after you need not have to meditate 24 hours, while you may sit down and meditate 2 or 3 hours a day, or 1 hour. The rest of the time you should be concerned yourself with how to end this war, to express your opinions to the authorities concerned and things like that. In 1960, that makes the difference. He studied comparative religion at the Columbia University and Princeton University, two well-known universities in USA. So he went there and did comparative studies. And by 1961, he was already teaching comparative religion at the Princeton University. And 1962, he taught and researched Buddhism at the Columbia University. So you notice that by then he is already 30-something, and he was spending his time teaching in the West. And perhaps for this reason, he is well known in the West. And whereas if you look at this was a time when Vietnam was in war, a lot of killings and suffering, but he was actually in the West. Only in 1963 he returned to Vietnam. That was about coming to the peak of the Vietnamese War. 1963 he returned to Vietnam and participated in the peace movement. In 1964, he founded the Van Hanh Buddhist University in the temple in Saigon, and the School of Youth for Social Services, SYSS. This School of Youth for Social Services is a neutral corps of Buddhist peace workers who went into rural areas to establish schools, build healthcare clinics, and help rebuild villages. So he was providing social services to the community through his youth. And in fact, later on, you will see that some of his youth actually joined him to become monks and nuns. So in fact, 1966, he established the Order of Interbeing, a new order based on the traditional Buddhist Bodhisattva precepts. So that perhaps because of his ingenuity, instead of saying that he is the order of the Zen or order of the Tian Kai or whatever, he started a new order called the Order of Interbeing. Interbeing here mainly talking about interconnectedness, interdependence. So he established this order, and some of the first few monks and nuns ordained were from the SYSS. Okay? So from 63 right until 66, he was conducting demonstrations and providing social services to the Vietnamese. And by the way, when he provided all these services, at that time, the South Vietnamese government were very suspicious of the Buddhists. They thought the Buddhists were communists. These communists put on the robe and very actively involved in the anti-government. So now 1966, he went to USA and Europe, and from then on he couldn't come back to the country, and he was exiled for 39 years. So when he was in USA, he actually went to USA and mainly to lobby those peace fighters in the West to get their support to stop the war. So 1967, he met Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King was very impressed with him. And in fact, Martin Luther King nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, he didn't get it because he was just one of the many who were involved in the anti-war. But perhaps he's well known in the West because as a Vietnamese, he was one of the very few who could communicate easily in the West with his English and French. In 1969, there was almost how many years? Almost 12, 13 years after into the war, there was a peace conference held in Paris to end the Vietnamese War. So eventually the war ended in 1975, but the peace negotiations started in 1969. I was then a kid and I read the newspaper every day. I could remember what happened in 1963. So in 1969, I also could remember. They spent the first few months or perhaps the first year talking about how to sit, where to sit in the peace conference table. So they have to come up with a final solution of a so-called big round table so that all of us are equal, So we human beings sometimes can be very childish, isn't it? So children fight, we also fight. We even fight over where to sit. Okay? So he was one of the leaders who represented the Buddhists. Okay? And then 1970, he was again lecturer and researcher at Buddhism University of Sorbonne, Paris. So now he has came over to Paris. And then 1975 onwards, the war ended. He still could not come back to Vietnam. He stayed in he started a sweet potato Buddhist community, started a small Buddhist community. And 1962, that community grew to become the Plum Village. So today, Plum Village is a popular destination for many Western Buddhists in France. In 2005, after a long exile, he was finally permitted to visit Vietnam. So he came back to Vietnam. He did some ordination. There was a big splash of news all over, and this was actually not welcomed by some people who was dead against the Vietnamese government. So they said he had finally relented to the Vietnamese government and supported the Vietnamese government. Because today's Vietnamese government is still, theoretically speaking, a communist government. So, and to some Buddhists, there had not been some degree of religious freedom in Vietnam, even till today. So some Buddhist leaders were very upset when Thich Nhat Hanh decided to go back to Vietnam. But the majority would support his wish to go back to Vietnam. So in 2018, again he came. He returned to Vietnam to spend his remaining days at his root temple near Hue, central Vietnam. So 2018, actually he was very sick already. By 2016, he was already sick, and actually sort of like terminally ill. And there was news that he had passed away, but actually he didn't pass away. And 2018, he came back to settle down for good in Vietnam. Now, why Thich Nhat Hanh is so popular? Because He's a Zen monk, he's a teacher, he's a poet, he's a peace activist, and he's an author of more than 100 books. And now he is very well known because of his many talks in the USA, Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia, France, and so on. This is especially like Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia, France is after the war. Okay, so his approach was to introduce and produce and popularize. There shouldn't be a word, rather that introduce and popularize mindfulness to the West. So that's why he became so famous. But I think the main reason, you see, the main reason in the West, they adore him very much is because of his language proficiency. He was able to attract a lot of Westerners, whereas a lot of other people from the East, when they go over to the West, they preach to their own community. For example, Sri Lankan preach to the Sri Lankan, the Chinese preach to the Chinese, and so on. Whereas I said, it's my observation that the Tibetan Buddhism and Vietnamese Buddhism do better than the Sri Lankan and Chinese Buddhism in the West, because the Tibetans and the Vietnamese community was very small, very small. So those monks who went over there would have to step out of their own community to try to reach out to the local Westerners. Whereas the Chinese, the Sri Lankans, or even the Thais, when they reach the West, they will be immediately surrounded by their own people from their homeland, and they would have great difficulties trying to step up also. Or perhaps it's more comfortable just to continue to cater to say 100 or 200 Thai or Sri Lankan or Chinese staying around the temple. So if you look at his history, he was involved in peace activity from 1963 after his return from USA right until 66, actually only 3-4 years. After that, when the war was over, he was not socially engaged in any way anymore. And yet he is well known because of his language proficiency and his writings. He has many writings, and his way of introduction of Buddhism in the West very much more attractive to the Western people. So these are some of his work. In his book, You Are Here, he urged people to pay attention to what they were experiencing in their body and mind at any given moment, and not dwell in the past or think of the future. His emphasis is on the awareness of the breath. So he was a meditation teacher on the breath. Okay. Thich Nhat Hanh's mindfulness practices don't advocate disengagement with the world. Rather, in his view, the practice of mindfulness could lead one towards compassionate action, like practicing openness to others' viewpoints and sharing material resources with those in need. What he was trying to say is, when you practice a lot of mindfulness, you are mindful of your own bodily action, your thought, your speech, then you go inwards and realize that you have the great heart of compassion. And out of this compassion would outflow your actions to others, to practicing to others, to help others, to provide them and share with them your resources, your viewpoints, and to accept also their viewpoints. So he believed that mindfulness is the foundation of this socially engaged movement. Here is just a story of how he related to a Westerner young girl who asked him how to deal with the grief of a recently deceased dog. Then he instructs her to look into the sky and watch a cloud disappear. The cloud has not died, but has become the rain and the tea in the teacup. And just as the cloud is alive in a new form, so is the dog. So being aware and mindful of the tea offers a reflection on the nature of reality. So that is how he tried to present, instead of talking about the conventional way of we are talking about rebirth, which some people will find it hard to believe or superstitious. He make it this very simply. Just like cloud can turn into rain to water, water into our cup of tea. So this kind of form changes, the form changes. He introduced this kind of form changes that would make it much more receptive, much more easier to understand. So by the way, I just relate you a story here. Otherwise, you have too many direct lectures. It would be too boring for you. Since we are on this topic, uh, there was a Westerner. He came from Bangkok to Kuala Lumpur to see the chief high priest of Malaysia. He was in a hurry, but he had a question that he needed an answer. So he rushed to the temple and told the chief reverend Kesri Namananda, I can accept many things in Buddhism, but I find rebirth very difficult to understand. How can one life born into another life? But I need you to explain this not in a very lengthy manner, but in a very fast manner. Because I'm in a hurry to the airport. Then our chief reverend said, now you listen to my radio. Okay? Now you listen to my. Then now you look at my fan. My fan is a motion. Okay? My radio give you the sound. Sound and motion, they are so different, right? Completely different. So it's just like humans and animals, or humans and goats, they are so very different. But the energy is the same. That fan is powered by electricity. This radio is also powered by electricity. So when I needed to use my radio, my electricity, I switch on my electricity to the radio. And when I need to use my fan, I switch on and the energy goes to the radio. I go to the fans. So the energy flow is the same and the energy flow just go on and it can take many forms. So it can be in the form of sound, can be form of sight, form of motion, things like that. So the white man was like, okay, I understand now. And we rushed to the airport. Okay. Now, Thich Nhat Hanh tried to come up with his own interpretation of the precepts in line with his thinking on the socially engaged Buddhism. So instead of talking about killing, we always say Panatipata Veramani Sikkhapadam Samadhiyami, not to break the life of breathing beings. Panati, breathing beings, which means beings with a life. Okay? So reference for life. He goes this way, aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life. So you begin with mindfulness. You are mindful of the suffering that a life would have to go through if they are destroyed. I'm committed to cultivating the insight of interbeing and compassionate and learning ways to protect the lives of people, animals, plants, and universe. See, so we need to cultivate the insight. When we look inside and see the interconnectors of all our beings. All life forms are interconnected in one way or another. And then we feel compassionate for them and we try to protect them from protect their life. So I am determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to support any act of killing in the world. Okay. So this is a foundation of peace activities. So it's no more just killing by the precept of killing is no longer just as simple as chanting Paratipata Veramani, or you yourself do not kill. Here it's talking about I am not going to kill, but I will not let others kill, and I will support any act. I will not support any act of killing. So war is killing, so he will go against it. Then mindfully, he would say the next thing is harmful actions like killing, arises from anger, fear, greed, and intolerance. Okay, which in turn come from dualistic and discriminative thinking. Our dualistic thinking is always I'm right, you are wrong. Okay, I'm good, you are bad. So it cannot be I'm good, you are also good, or it's always I'm good, you are bad, or I'm right, you are wrong. So this dualistic thinking, so this kind of discriminative thinking, and then anger, greed, intolerance arise. Therefore, I will cultivate openness, non-discrimination, and non-attachment to views in order to transform violence, fanaticism, and normatism in my life. So you see his interpretation of non-killing. The first precept of non-killing uh, is very much wider now. It's based on a mindfulness contemplation of the implications from our actions, and then and how to reduce this precept. It's not just talking about precept, it's just how to do it. So we need to be open and non-discriminative and non-attachment to views. Okay? Killing, the next one, stealing. Okay? Stealing. But he defines stealing now in another way. In fact, I think in most of his articles, you can't find those traditional presentation, that we used to have. I observed the precept of no killing. I preserve a precept of no stealing and things like that. He would make it this way. Just now, the first one is reverence for life. The second one is true happiness. He's talking about stealing, expanding the precept of stealing caused by exploitation, suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing and oppression. I'm committed to practicing generosity in my thinking, speaking, and acting. So instead of stealing, now I try to, on the other side, the proactive side, generosity. Okay? So his precept is always two sides. Not to do certain thing, but to do something else. So it's not to kill, but also to protect life. Okay? It's not to steal, but to practice generosity. I'm determined not to steal and not to possess anything that should belong to others. And I will share my time, energy, and material resources with those who are in need. Okay? Then you can have true happiness. Killing, stealing, lying. Killing, stealing. This one. Next one, the third one. I will practice looking deeply to see that happiness and suffering of others are not separate from my own happiness and suffering. That true happiness is not possible, still on the stealing, true happiness is not possible without understanding and compassion. And that running after wealth, fame, power, and sensual pleasures can bring much suffering and despair. So expanding the precept of stealing, even to the extent talking about, if you are running after wealth, fame, power, sensual pleasures, and things like that, then it will cause us suffering. So I'm aware that happiness depends on my mental attitude and not on external conditions, and that I can live happily in the present moment simply by remembering that I already have more than enough conditions to be happy. So on this aspect, he stressed on the last one, right livelihood. Need to live a life of right livelihood so that I can help reduce the suffering of living beings on earth and stop contributing to climate change, even to the extent of talking about climate change now, environmentalism. So the third one, sexual misconduct. He defined it in true love. Aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I'm committed to cultivating responsibility and learning ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and societies. So it's not only you yourself not committing adultery, but also to protect the safety and integrity of others. Okay. Then, knowing that sexual desire is not love, and that sexual activity motivated by craving always harms myself as well as others, I'm determined not to engage in sexual relations without true love and a deep long-term commitment made known to my family and friends. See? Well, he did not use the word marriage, but a long-term commitment made known to my family and friends. Okay? Now, on this sexual misconduct, he was very concerned with child abuse in the society. So this precept goes further to say, I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken up by sexual misconduct. Then again, seeing that body and mind are one, I'm committed to learning appropriate ways to take care of my sexual energy and cultivating loving kindness, compassion, joy, and inclusiveness. Loving kindness, metta; compassion, karuna; joy, mudita; and inclusiveness, upekka. So he used the word inclusiveness, which are the four basic elements of true love. We call this the four limitless power, or limitless mind. So we have a lot of energy, and instead of misusing our energy, he's saying that we should direct this energy to become more kind and more compassionate, to fill ourselves with joy and inclusiveness. Practicing true love, we know that we will continue beautifully into the future. Then after that, on speech, instead of we just talking about I shall not lie, he expanded to loving speech and the other side, listening. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others, I'm committed to cultivating loving speech and compassion, and compassionate listening in order to relieve suffering and to promote reconciliation and peace to myself and among other people, ethnic and religious groups and nations. So it's not only just about not lying, but truthful speech and also listening is rest. Now, knowing that words can create happiness or suffering, I am committed to speaking truthfully using words that inspire confidence, joy, and hope. So when I look at these were the words used by Venerable Shin Yin also, Venerable Shin Yin say the four gifts of Reverend Shin Yin: give confidence, give joy, give hope, and give convenience. Venerable Shin Yin mentioned four. So you think sometimes the great masters think alike, okay? And we always ended up with wrong speech because we have anger. So when anger is manifesting in me, I am determined not to speak. I will practice mindful breathing and walking in order to recognize and to look deeply into my anger. So whenever you are angry, quickly take a deep breath and do some walking meditation in order to realize that you have anger. Okay? There is a Buddhist organization in Malaysia, the Tusita Hermitage in Kuching. They have a constitution for the members to follow. And one of the rules that they had enacted is that in a meeting, if you are angry, you forfeit your right to speak. The moment you are angry, you're not allowed to speak. Please get out of the hall. You can only come and speak when your mind is cool and calm. So I find that that rule is very useful, because a lot of times things turn bad because of our anger, and then we speak the wrong things. So the moment you realize that you are angry, quickly walk out of the room. Okay. I know that the roots of anger can be found in my wrong perceptions and lack of understanding and suffering in myself and in the other person. And then, still on talking on speaking, I will speak and listen in a way that can help myself and the other person to transfer suffering and see the way out of difficult situation. I am determined not to spread news that I do not know to be certain and not to utter words that can cause division or discord. Today we have fake news all over the world. And this has become a big problem now, So sometimes government come up with anti-fake news law. We also don't like. We want to have the freedom to speak. So we have fake news, fake pictures all over the world today. So just do be careful. Determine for yourself whether the news are right or wrong. But for us, we should not be spreading news that we have no certainty, we have no confirmation whether it is right or wrong. And next, he said, I will practice right diligence to nourish my capacity for understanding, love, joy, and inclusiveness. Metta, Karuna, Mudita, and Upekka, and gradually transform anger, violence, and fear that lie deep in my consciousness. Then, number 5, I observe the precept of not taking, not consuming things that can intoxicate my mind. Okay, so this he expanded it to, he renamed it as nourishment and healing. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption, I'm committed to cultivating good health, both physical and mental, for myself, my family, and my society by practicing mindful eating, drinking, and consuming. So when you want to eat, you want to drink, you want to buy clothes, or you want to buy shoes, mindfully think about it first. And I will practice looking deeply into how I consume the 4 kinds of nutriments, namely edible foods, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. In Buddhism, it is said that we are fed not only by food, the edible food. No, we are fed by 4 types of food. So apart from the edible food, another one is all the senses. We are fed every day. You read, you look at nice pictures, you look at sceneries. We need all these things to feed ourselves, our senses. Do you realize that if you confine yourself to an empty room for some time, you can go crazy. Why? Because your senses are deprived of objects. Psychologists have done this so-called big tank experiment. Big tank experiment means you put a person into a big tank where he could not see anything. Only the 4 walls and the top part also covered. So you are like in a box, but in a big tank. And if you are there for say 8 hours, you are already about to go crazy. And you begin to have anxiety, worry, fear. You don't know whether people know that you are inside here or not, or they have forgotten me, they have put me here for experiment, now they have run away, and now I'm stuck in this room. And maybe after 20 hours, you begin to scratch the wall and those things, and if nobody responded to you, more probably you will shout and scream, and maybe you will think of committing suicide. So you notice, actually we need, our senses need to be fed every day, just like our food. Okay. Then of course the next one is volition and consciousness. Volition refers to actions. Every day we need to do something. Can you imagine we do nothing? You lie down and do nothing. You will feel you will be like deprived of food. And of course the last one is consciousness. This will be referring to our ability to be conscious, to be alive. Okay. So Thich Nhat Hanh said, instead of just talking about not to consume intoxicants, but also to meditate and mindful of what we are taking in, these four nutrients. And go further some more, not to gamble. Some Buddhists say in the 5 precepts, there's no mention of gambling. So we Buddhists can gamble, right? This is a wrong argument, because the precepts, the 5 precepts are basic precepts to prevent us from falling into the hell plane, to allow us to maintain our human life, to allow us to live dignified in dignity as a human beings. So we cannot put everything into the precepts. So the Buddha listed the 5 minimal precepts, but other things which are not advisable to do, those not listed in the 5 precepts, they were mentioned elsewhere. The Buddha advised, for example, in the Sikalawada Sutta, not to gamble. So not to gamble was an advice given by the Buddha in the Sikalawada Sutta. So we need not have to be very rigid, saying that since it's not mentioned in the 5 precepts, therefore we can gamble. Okay, so here it says not to gamble, not to use alcohol, drugs, or any other products which contains toxins. And when he talk about products of toxins, it's not only just about the food that we put into our mouth now. We are talking about websites, games, TV programs, films, magazine, books, and so on. I will practice coming back to the present moment to be in touch with the refreshing, healing, and nourishing elements in me and around me, not letting regrets and sorrow drag me back into the past, nor letting anxieties, fear, or craving pull me up to the present moment. So this was his way of interpreting the 5 precepts. So in the plant village, people might not be aware of the 5 precepts. They are only aware of the 5 mindfulness training. Okay. This is continue again. Then actually he came up with another one, 14 mindfulness training, which is a more complete one now for his disciples. Okay, but we are not going to spend time on this 14 because too many. If you have time, you go and do it by yourself. Now we do an evaluation on the Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh is well known in the West to the extent that people forgot about the earlier revival efforts in Vietnam. Some people mistaken Thich Nhat Hanh as a revivalist of Buddhism in Vietnam. No, he is not. The revivalists were earlier than him. Okay, he came in much later. It's just like we forgot about what happened before Tai Chi. You know, most people would know about Tai Chi, but most people would not know about Yang Wen Hui. Okay, so but he became well known in the West because of his proficiency in English and French, and his work. He spent, 39 years he spent in the West. So he is perhaps better known than Xun Yi in the West. But because Xun Yi spent most of his time in Taiwan, he hardly spent time in the West, and Xun Yi could not speak directly to the West in English. So that's why Thich Nhat Hanh become more famous, despite the fact that in terms of Buddhist movement, perhaps Xun Yi is 10 times bigger. And he has one strength. His presentation of the Buddha's teaching in the context of modernity makes Buddhism more engaged to the modern world, more appealing to the Western audience and the spiritually inclined, especially with his emphasis on mindfulness. Okay? On this evaluation, I would like to say that the revival of Buddhism in Vietnam must have happened earlier, as Te means Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh, his disciples call him Te. I think it is the Pali word for Bante, Te. So it is an honorific given by his disciples. He was as a monk. As a young monk, he could enter a secular university, and he could even travel to the West to enter Princeton and Columbia University. So the revival of Buddhism in Vietnam must have happened earlier than him. And he was not instrumental in the revival of Buddhism in Vietnam, but he was socially engaged in the Buddhism in Vietnam from the 1963 to 1966. His fame came about after the Buddhist struggle of 1966 with his connections and teaching in the West. And the last part, after the war, he disengaged from engaged Buddhism. Actually, after the war, he is no longer talking about engaged Buddhism. He was just preaching meditation or mindfulness in the West. Uh, and he was not bothered with all the other issues uh, in the world. His good friend, Sulak Sivaraksa from Thailand, the founder of the International Network of Engaged Buddhism, actually had a dialogue with him and asked him, why you talk so much about socially engaged Buddhism, and in the end, after the war, you are completely disengaged. And the answer was no answer. He said he was mumbling away here and there, and no conclusive answer could be obtained from him. So actually, Sulak commented, meditation has become a high-value spa in the West, eroded by capitalism. So you are teaching mindfulness every day as a kind of value spa, high-value spa. So that was extracted from the book that I showed you yesterday on Sivalaksa. So that is roughly about Thich Nhat Hanh. Okay. Shall we take a rest? You have any question about Thich Nhat Hanh first? If not, we'll take a rest. You hear me, right? Okay. Yep. So we straight away jumped into Thich Nhat Hanh just now because he's an iconic figure in the Vietnamese Buddhist movement. But there were actually many others who were lesser known to the West, but equally, if not more important. So now we look at some of the early Buddhist revivalists in Vietnam. According to records, there is a Buddhist revival movement that emerged in the 1920s in an effort to reform and strengthen the institutional Buddhism, which had lost ground to the spread of Christianity and the growth of other faiths under French rule. And this movement continued until 1950s. So generally speaking, from 1920 to 1950, there was a period of Buddhist revival. So like I said earlier, Thich Nhat Hanh was not involved then. Or rather, he was a product of the revivalist movement. Then this movement, the objective was to translate the wisdom and compassion that Buddhists strive to develop into concrete actions. We need to look at the background. During the 1920s, it was not preordained that one need not eat dirt forever, that one could join with others to forge change. And the Vietnamese Buddhists, like other revolutionaries at that time, tried to remake their religion to engage with all these changes, social political changes. Then, as what Thich Nhat Hanh commented, before the 1920s and during the revival period, high-ranking monks developed Buddhism by traveling throughout Vietnam and holding well-attended lectures, as well as reprinting sutras in Chinese and translating them into Ngu, or national language, the national language of the Vietnamese. This is done because the new generation of Vietnamese now could not read Chinese. The Vietnamese text in the early days was in Chinese. So now with the introduction of Romanized writing, the new generations could not read Chinese. Therefore, they had to make efforts to translate Chinese sutras into Vietnamese language. And as a scholar argued, the abundance of Buddhist texts and sutras published during colonial time preceded the revival. The publication of writings that came out of the Buddhist revival was only part of a larger urge to publish and spread the Dhamma. It means to say that even before 1920s, there was already a lot of Buddhist literature around. But except that after the 1920s, there was a surge, more publications come about, a larger urge to publish and spread the Dhamma. So the awareness came much stronger during the 1920 onwards. But that does not mean that before 1920 nothing happened. There was also some Buddhist activities going on. So some people said there was actually no decline of Buddhism in Vietnam. So why talking about revival? But to me, actually the revival happened during the decline. Just like during Tai Chi's time or during Yang Wenhui's time, you notice that there were a lot of publications. For example, Yang Wenhui published 1 million literatures to be distributed. But does it mean that Buddhism already revived at that time, or there was no sign of decline? Exactly because there was a sign of decline that Yang Wenhui made efforts to publish more. So to me, there's no contradiction. So because to some people, not so much due to the decline of Buddhism, because they believe that even before 1920s, we were having a lot of publications and we had a lot of Dhamma talks and they were all well attended. So what are you talking about decline of Buddhism in Vietnam? But we become more active because we need to remove Buddhism to meet the needs of nationalism. Anyway, we can conclude quite safely that nationalism was the driving force behind the Vietnamese Buddhist revival. As Confucianism failed as a morality and national ideology to cope with the colonial modernity, many young Vietnamese intellectuals of the 1920s and 1930s were researching for a religion to replace Confucianism. And Buddhism seems like a good choice at that time. Now, we must not forget that there's a great connection between Vietnam and China in those days. One of the earliest revivalists, Tian Chu, for example, he was preaching the Tai Chi's 整理生协制度论, the restructuring of the Sangha system. So obviously, Tian Chu was exposed to the Chinese Buddhism, especially the propagation material of Tai Chi. So, and he was actually propagating that at that time. So we noticed that there was a strong Chinese influence on Vietnamese Buddhism during that time. Modern publishing and information flow fed Buddhist revival, meaning to say, you know, before 1920s or even earlier, there was very little information flow and very little publishing flow. Publication was not something like today's, like what we have today, you know, where information flows so very easily and in abundance. Whereas in the older days, information does not flow so well. But after 1920s, there is a great amount of publishing in places like Shanghai or near the coastal area of China. So this modern publishing and information from China, particularly from Shanghai, reached Vietnam. And we must also know that at that time, there is a historical translocal Buddhist and trade network between China and Vietnam. So, for example, Hai Chao Ying, the publication that I mentioned to you yesterday, which was published in the earlier days in China, then later on Hong Kong, which Reverend Chok Mo brought to Malaysia, and is now in Malaysia. That magazine, or Buddhist magazine, Hai Chao Ying, The Sound of Sea Tide, was also sent to Vietnam, exported to Vietnam. at a time when the Vietnamese could still read Chinese. And then in 1928 alone, in the year 1928, there were 400,000 overseas Chinese in South Vietnam, of which 100,000 in Saigon. So it is a very big population. There is a big population of Chinese in Vietnam during that time, and they travel frequently between China and Vietnam. So there was a lot of connection. So the Chinese influence was very strong. Okay? And in fact, Chinese monks continue to come into Vietnam during the revival period. That's why you noticed yesterday when I show you the travel of Venerable Tai Shi, he visited Vietnam, and he in fact had Chinese disciples of him located in Vietnam. Well, some people would argue that there was indeed a decline with pagodas dilapidated and monks leading indisciplined way of life, like what we observe also in Qing Dynasty China. But then I would agree that there was a kind of decline, but at the same time, during that period of decline, there was also a lot of revivalist activities. That's why there was more publications and more talks going on. So one of the earliest champions was Tian Chu, born 1898, died 1974. One of the earliest champions of the Vietnamese revivalist movement. He is commonly regarded as the most prominent in the revival. But just for your information, he finally got disenchanted with the Buddhism and he left the Sangha in 1933. But anyway, his contribution in the early revival was part of the history and could not be just erased away just because he had finally become a Marxist. He openly challenged a fundamental Pure Land belief by proclaiming that the material world was real instead of illusionary. You know, in Mahayana Buddhism, we tend to say that this world that we are living in now, this loka, this world that we are living today, is an illusion. And we want to go to the real world. The real world is the Western paradise. The Pure Land, the Western paradise. Don't you challenge this concept? No. This is the real world. Whatever it is very much similar to Dhammatram's insistence that we should build pure land on this earth. And for Guangsan's same strategy, we should build pure land on this earth. This is the man or the monk Tian Chu. Tian Chu had three important questions to answer. His first question, why Buddhism declined? And number two is, what was the best way to revive Vietnamese Buddhism? And number three, who should lead the revival? So to answer these three questions, Tian Chu argued that the decline of Vietnamese Buddhism began with the French colonialism. To illustrate his points, Tian Chu gave a quick history of Vietnamese Buddhism. According to him, Buddhism came to Vietnam during the 6th century by China. Okay? And it flourished 6th century in China by China is around Tang Dynasty. And it flourished during the Ding and the Le and the Tran dynasty with many eminent monks who were well versed in Chinese language as well as the Dhamma. So language played a very important part here. The early monks were well versed in the Chinese language. And from the 6th to the 19th century, regardless of Chinese rule, Vietnamese Buddhism kept its luster because Vietnam and China shared the same language and the same religion. Tian Chu speculated that this mutuality in language and religion eliminated the need to translate sutra from Chinese into Vietnamese. This, however, became a problem with the French arrival. In fact, today in Korea, where they are making efforts to remove the kanji or the Chinese writing in the Korean language, it is also making it very difficult now for the young generation of Koreans to know their past, because they could not read literature of the past. Specifically, Tianqiu located the decline of Vietnamese Buddhism in the French colonial education. The French introduced their educational system. Since France became the protectorate of our nation, bringing us a new culture and a new science, the citizens of our nation steadily favored the new Western studies. Naturally, Chinese studies had to decline. This marked the decline of Buddhism in our nation as well. So this is the impact of, if you like, you say modernization. It's an impact of Western culture with a much more attractive educational system. So people shifted to Western studies rather than Chinese studies. In fact, the shift in language occurred when Governor General Albert Sarot introduced radical educational reforms into China in 1918. The new policy waived tuition for public schooling during the first 6 years of instruction, and primary instruction was exclusively in French and in the recently adopted Romanized Vietnamese script, known as the Quoc Ngu. Now, with the new policy, when you are given 6 years of free education, naturally the children would, or the parents would send their children to this 6 years of free education rather than to go to the non-free, the paid Chinese studies schools. And so most people would opt for the free education provided by the French. And the primary instruction at that time was exclusively French. So Vietnamese students began to study the French language rather than the Chinese language. And at that time they began to use a Romanized Vietnamese script. Like this one, this is Vietnamese. Today this is considered Vietnamese. If in the early days, if in Chinese writing, it will be the okay. So the effects were profound. Most significantly, within a single generation, not only were most educated Vietnamese unable to read Chinese or Japanese, but they were incapable of reading anything that any Vietnamese had written during the previous 2 millennia. So whatever that the Vietnamese had written over the last 2,000 years, now the new generation of Vietnamese could not read. So this is a very strong cultural change. Then that was the problem. To him, that was the problem that caused the decline of Buddhism in Vietnam. Then what is the solution? What was the solution? So he envisioned a 3-part project to revive Vietnamese Buddhism. Whereas Tai Shi talked about 3-pronged strategies, about Sangha reform, about property reform, about reform on the teachings to stress on humanistic, and also about Sangha reform. So those were the 3 reforms. And Tianqiu, being exposed to what Tai Shi wrote, also proposed 3 strategies for the Vietnamese revival. Establish a Buddhist publishing house which would make it easy to promulgate the Dhamma, to restore Buddhism, and to eliminate superstition. So again, Buddhist publishing house to make information and materials easily available. Now this one is very much similar to what Yang Ren San or Yang Wenhui did in China in the 1800s, the late 1800s. Then the built Buddhist Studies Institute to properly train monks who could later promote Buddhism. This is a similar advocacy of, this is similar to the advocacy of Venerable Taishi, built Buddhist colleges, Buddhist training centers. Traditionally, monks were trained in temples, but the so-called training would require a lot of effort by the disciple himself, not the masters. How could the master find time to teach like what we are doing today? The master would be engrossed in his own ritualistic activities and his own meditation and things like that. So proper education was quite impossible in the temple. So learning Buddhism in the temple, which was a tradition, became a challenge, and therefore we talk about Buddhist Study Institute or colleges to promote Buddhism. And the third strategy, he talked about translation of the sutra into Kok Mu, so that Vietnamese Buddhism would not lose its roots in the future. This was one of them we mentioned earlier. They translated the suttas from the original Chinese language to Kok Mu, or the Vietnamese national language. So this was his three-pronged strategies. But after he was very disenchanted, after all his efforts, he found that actually nothing much worked. So he was very disenchanted. So later he left the monkhood. Okay. Now at one time he turned to the atheism in Buddhism against the idea of God. So he liked very much the idea of no God in Buddhism. But he left Buddhism in 1933, went for Marxism, and subsequently imprisoned, and later he left for Hanoi. So he was very much more inclined to Marxism. So after his departure, the popularity of Vietnamese revival flourished further. So just now we were talking about Tien Chu, one of the earliest revivalists, and what were his outlook. But his personal proposals or his outlooks were not so successful. So we need to look at the institutional success of the revival. In terms of institution or organizations, to some extent, the Buddhist revival in Vietnam was successful in terms of the institutions. Before proceeding further, just to share with you that Vietnam can be divided into three parts. The top part is called Thong Kinh. Okay, the top part, the northern part is called Thong Kinh. The middle part is called An Nam, and the southern part is called Cochin, China. So basically, there were actually three different parts of Vietnam, and Buddhism was strongest in the An Nam area or in the central area. So the An Nam Buddhist Association was formed quite early, and with the An Nam Buddhist Association, as early as 1935, they celebrated Pisak on a grand scale, May 9 to 10. And Vietnam at that time had an emperor, Emperor Bảo Tai. Emperor Bảo Tai, he attended this ceremony. So that shows that the An Nam Buddhist Association was quite strong at that time. They even conducted a Buddhist wedding. This very much maybe learning from the Christians, because otherwise earlier than that, in the East, there's very no such thing as like a Buddhist wedding. Buddhist weddings usually done in China, Confucius style, or ancestral worship style. Nobody would invite monk to a wedding in those days. In 1940s, you have a Buddhist wedding in Vietnam under the sponsorship of the An Nam Buddhist Association. Then The Annam Buddhist Association also established a monastic school, although they were not the first one. The first one was by the Cochin China Buddhist Association, 1934, but failed. So you have the Annam Buddhist Association setting up another one. So it succeeded in maintaining a monastic school and make an impact on the monastic education during the 1930s and 40s. So with that monastic school, actually they trained some very good monks to lead Buddhism later. And more importantly, the Annam Buddhist Association made possible the idea that a monastic education could revive Vietnamese Buddhism. Because of the Annam Buddhist Association's effort by having that monastic education, then it gave an example to others that it is possible to revive Vietnamese Buddhism. Then this model of the Annam Buddhist Association was followed by the Tonkin Buddhist Association in the north. So Tonkin Buddhist Association in the north. Then the schools created a cohort of monks from different regions in Vietnam, such as Thich Tien Ho, Thich Trích Quang, and Thich Tam Cho. It's so difficult to remember all the names, but probably we'll be talking about Thich Trích Quang, who later became the head of Vietnamese Buddhism in the south. Okay, so all these people served as leaders of the Buddhist struggle movement in the Republic of Vietnam during the 60s. So we can see here the important role played by the Buddhist institutes or the Buddhist colleges. They trained monks who eventually became Buddhist leaders in the 1960s. In the 1950s, the World Fellowship of Buddhist Conference was held in Kuala Lumpur, and the delegation from the Annam Buddhist Association attended this particular conference. There was no unified Vietnam at that time, but you have the Annam Buddhist Association attended the World Fellowship of Buddhist Conference, and that also gave them a lot of inspirations that they need to revive Vietnamese Buddhism, make Vietnamese Buddhism stronger, to join the big family of Buddhists in the world. Now, the important thing is, subsequently, the next year, 1951, the Annam Buddhist Association, the Tonkin Buddhist Association, the Cochin China Buddhist Association, they came together and formed the All Vietnamese Buddhist Association. Okay. So this revivalist movement came to a height where they were able to form a unified national Buddhist organization. And they changed the date of the Buddha birthday and flying the Buddhist flag. The Buddha's birthday, you notice that just now Annam Buddhist Association, they celebrated during the month of May. It is on the full moon day in the month of May that we call Vesak Day, that we identify as the day when the Buddha was born, attained enlightenment, and entered into Mahaparinibbana. 3 occasions on the same day. Then, Annam Buddhist Association, despite the fact that it is Mahayana, actually followed this Vesak Day, which is very much Theravada. Because Theravada countries like Thailand or Myanmar or Sri Lanka, the Vesak Day is always on the full moon day in the month of May. Whereas Mahayana countries is always on the 8th day of the month of the 8th day in the 4th month in the lunar calendar. So it's a different day. So we have a similar situation in Malaysia. So eventually, when the 3 organizations, Annam, Tonkin, and Cochin China, when they came together, they were able to agree to a date, and that is on the full moon day of month of May. And I think that is a great achievement. That is a similar achievement in Malaysia. We eventually came to agree that Vesak Day should be, that the birthday of the Buddha should be on the full moon day in the month of May. So these two cases are quite unique because places like Taiwan, Macau, Hong Kong, they still use the 8th day of the 4th month in the lunar calendar. So it's still different. So that is briefly the background of the early revivalists in China. In Vietnam. Now I would like to go on to talk about the engaged Buddhism during the Vietnam War. As you know, the Vietnam War started sometime in 1955, the end of 1955. Before that, they had another war, also we call it the anti-France war, where they fought the French. So that one was called the First Indochina War. The second one is called the Second Indochina War, but more well known as the Vietnam War, 1955 to 75. But actually, the war is not only Vietnam War; it's the whole of Indochina. Laos and Cambodia were also involved in the war. American planes took off from Thailand or from Cambodia, and the Vietnamese infiltrated the North Vietnamese infiltrated the South Vietnamese by going through Laos. So these three countries were embroiled in the war. So not only Vietnam was involved, at least three countries were involved, and Thailand provided a launching pad for the planes, for some of the planes, not all. So during this very difficult time, Buddhism emerged. But before that, we need to talk about the situation from the Buddhist perspective. I'm not going to talk about war. I'm going to talk about the perspective of Buddhism, from the perspective of Buddhism. So we have here the president of Vietnam, South Vietnam, Ho Thi Minh, who was president in the year 1963. In fact, he became a very powerful man in Vietnam because of his family background. They were somehow or other related to the Emperor Bao Tai. So they were related to Emperor Bao Tai. So he was a minister with Emperor Bao Tai, and then subsequently, when the North and South Vietnam was divided, I think around 1955, can't remember exactly. He became the president of the the southern Vietnam. He's a bachelor. He never get married. He's alone, a single person. But the bodyguard said they saw him used to be surrounded by good young-looking guys. So we don't know. But his brother, he has got many brothers. One of them is the Archbishop of Hue in central Vietnam. Another brother, younger brother, is served as an advisor to the president. This advisor to him. That brother is also the head of the secret police service, something like the head of your CIA or something like that. So the very powerful family in Vietnam, but all of them were very strong Catholics. One of his brothers that I mentioned to you just now in Hue, the Archbishop of Hue. And then you have another one, he's the head of the secret agency, and he is the president. So they instituted a number of measures to suppress Buddhism in an effort to try to make Vietnam a Catholic country. It's unfortunate that at that time they did not realize that to put North Indian as a Catholic to hate a country at this time was actually a wrong move, because they underestimated the strength of the Buddhists at that time, and they were thinking that perhaps the best way for Vietnam to come up from this trouble is to abandon the past, abandon Buddhism, Confucianism, and whatever, and embrace Western religions. Same happened to Chiang Kai-shek, and USA supported this. In fact, just a digression, after the Second World War, USA was involved in at least 3 wars in Asia, and lost all 3 wars. The first one was the Civil War in China, when USA supported Chiang Kai-shek, but eventually lost the war. And then the second one was Korean War, which eventually also lost the war. And the third one, Vietnam War, also lost the war. So it was quite a humiliation, especially to the president at that time. But he had not much choice when there were 50,000 US soldiers who died in the war. And there were anti-war campaigns all over in USA, demanding not to participate in this war. So Gotiniam, suppression of Buddhism, favoring Roman Catholics for public service and military promotions, as well as in the allocation of land, business arrangements, and tax concessions. This kind of discriminations you can find in many places, okay? Even in today. I'm not referring to one particular religion. It can be Buddhism, it can be Christianity, it can be Islam. People sometimes do practice discrimination. So in this particular case, it's well known. It was recorded that the president did tell somebody, if you want to be promoted, you have to convert to Catholic. They don't trust Buddhist generals. They trusted more the Catholic generals. And then the distribution of firearms to village self-defense saw weapons given only to Roman Catholics, because he doesn't trust the Buddhists, or he in fact most of the time suspected that the Buddhists are communists, but actually the Buddhists were not communists. But if you are not a Catholic, then chances are you might be a communist. So if I give weapons, I only give to the Roman Catholic, but not to the Buddhists. And some Roman Catholic priests ran their own private armies, and they were forced conversions and looting, shelling, and demolition of pagodas in some areas, to which government turned a blind eye. So this is not new. Even as recently as means about a decade ago, we have some of the Christians burning down Buddhist temples in South Korea. Okay, when there were forced conversion, looting, and so on, and pagodas burned down. Some Buddhist villagers converted en masse to receive aid or to avoid being forcibly settled by Dime's regime. So since Dime suspected that these so-called Buddhists were communists, so either you converted en masse to show your loyalty, or we will forcefully settle you somewhere else. Because if you continue to settle in some area, which you might be providing food or food or whatever to the communists, so they were forced to convert or to move to other areas. And then there is one thing. During the French rule that Buddhism is a private affair. Buddhism is a private affair. Therefore, you cannot have public activities unless you ask permission. So that practice continued even by Diem's time. So Diem would do it in such a way that he would not allow any public Buddhist activities. Another discrimination, Roman Catholics were also de facto exempt from the COVID labor that the government obliged all citizens to perform. So all citizens have to give some labor, provide to help the government to transport something, to do some work as part of their, today we call it taxes in money, those days taxes in terms of labor. But Roman Catholics exempted. And then when USA offered financial aid, then disproportionately distributed to Roman Catholic majority villages. The Roman Catholic Church was the largest landowner in the country and enjoyed special exemption in property acquisition, and land owned by the Roman Catholic Church exempted from land reform. So there was a land reform exercise going on. The government would take land, restructure them, redistribute them, but exemption was given to land owned by Roman Catholics. But land owned by Buddhist temples would be taken away for reform. Another thing is, while you say Buddhism is a private affair and therefore not allowed to hold public activities, the white and gold Vatican flag was regularly flown at all major public events in South Vietnam. And in 1959, Diem openly dedicated his country to Virgin Mary, despite the fact that actually Roman Catholics was just a small percentage of the total population, and the vast majority were Buddhist. And then the ban in the early May on flying the Buddhist flag on Vesak Day. Just days before, the Roman Catholics had been allowed to fly the Vatican flag at a celebration of the Archbishop Ngordin Thuc of Hue. Just now I mentioned to you, he has got one brother, Archbishop Ngordin Thuc of Hue in central Vietnam. When he did his celebration, it was reported that all the people in Hue area were forced to make contributions, to finance this large-scale celebration. And unfortunately, this was sometime, I think, in May. But the next day, when Buddhist flags were to be flown during the Vesak Day, it was banned. And this was the beginning, or this is the last straw on the camel's back. Last straw on the camel's back. Today, we call this the Hue Pat Dan shooting. Hue is the place. Pat Dan is the place. Sorry, Pat Dan means Phổ Tan. It means the birthday of the Buddha. So the Hue Pat Dan shooting. Today, if you go to Hue, you can find a memorial built there to indicate the incident of the Hue Pat Dan shooting. One monk by the name of Tik Trik Quang, we will talk about a little bit about him later. He led a civil disobedience. He disobeyed the ruling that you cannot fly the Buddhist flag. He insisted and he organized students to protest, to just continue with the celebrations. So police interfered and 9 people were shot dead by the police and 4 wounded. So this became a big news. This was the incident, the celebrations that was conducted in Hue. Okay. suppression by this is the battle between the demonstrators and the police. So after the shooting, of which 9 people died, Tik Kwang made 5 points demand to the government. Number 1, allow the flying of the Buddhist flags. And number 2, equal treatment for all religions. Number 3, compensation for the dead and the wounded. Number 4, end to arbitrary arrest. And number 5, punishment for the perpetrators. Unfortunately, this went on, and the frequency and the size of protesters increases as them refuse to comply to this demand. And so the story go on, and we are coming to. We will take a break now, then we come back. We will give you the later part of the story. Okay?
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we continue. Just now, we were talking about the suppression of Buddhism in Vietnam, despite the fact that the war was going on between the North and the South. Then the final, the straw on the camel's back came with the Hue Pakdan shooting, which took place at the eve of on the Vesak Day itself, where 9 people died. That was a large-scale demonstration, with thousands of people marching through the streets in Hue, demanding for religious freedom. And after the shooting, the Buddhist leaders made 5 points demand to the government to allow the flying of the Buddhist flags, equal treatment for all religions, compensation to the victims, the end to arbitrary arrest and punishment for perpetrators. Unfortunately, they refused to comply to the Buddhist demand, and the frequency and size of protests increases as time goes on. Then came that fateful day on the 11th of June 1963. I was then 10 years old. At 9 p.m. on the June of 10th, Tik Dung Biak of the Saloi Pagoda. Saloi means in Chinese is Li, means the relics, the Buddha relics pagoda. He telephones Brown, Mr. Malcolm Brown, is a war photographer, and other correspondents to alert them of a memorial service the following morning. So Tik Dung Biak called Malcolm and told him, Mr. Brown, I strongly advise you to come. I expect something very important will happen, but I cannot tell you what. So he told him to come. But actually, at that time, a lot of things were happening, and reporters were also getting fed up with the events that were unfolding. You know, with so many things happening. So some reporters sometimes just don't believe you. You know, whether this is really true or not true. But in this case, Mr. Malcolm turned up with his fellow reporters. So on the 11th June 1963, 1,000 protesters, together with a few hundred monks, marched to the busy street of Saigon in this car. And from this car came up this monk who sat in the middle of the road, and this fellow came and poured kerosene on top of him in a plastic container about 5 liters or 5 gallons rather, 2 cans. And this monk took out a matchstick by himself and lit himself to flames. So this photograph was taken by Malcolm Brown. So this is the kerosene tank, and this is the monk. And he was very steadily, just sitting down there, and the flame engulfed him very quickly. He's taking the picture from another perspective. He sat down there meditating. Eventually, when he was completely burnt, he fell down this way, and all the monks were praying, and the lay devotees praying, and this monk was bowing to him. David Huddleston, the New York Times reporters who won the prize for this news, he wrote, "I was to see that sight again, but once was enough. Flames were coming out from a human being. His body was slowly withering and shivering up, his head blackening and charring. In the air was the smell of burning human flesh. Human beings burn surprisingly quickly. Behind me, I could hear the sobbing of the Vietnamese who were now gathering. I was too shocked to cry, too confused to take notes or ask questions, too bewildered to even think. As he burnt, he never moved a muscle, never uttered a sound. His outward composure in sharp contrast to the wailing people around him. Malcolm Brown, the photographer who took the photograph, the sequence of pictures showed the initial shock of the flames coming from his face, the initial shock of the flames touching his face and so forth. He never cried out or screamed, but you could see from his expression that he was exposed to intense agony and that he was dying on the spot. And then in the end, when the body was rigidly burned, they could not stuff him into a casket because he was split up in all directions. So this is a great human tragedy. In fact, later on, when people asked Malcolm Brown how he took this picture and sent over to New York, he said the whole trick was to get it to some transmission point. We had to get the raw film. At that time, we don't have digital. We only have this raw film. We had to get the raw film shipped by air freight or some way. It was not subject to censorship at the point. We used a pigeon to get it as far as Manila. And in Manila, they had the apparatus to send it by radio. So, pigeon, are you sure it's a pigeon? A pigeon is a passenger on a regular commercial flight whom you have persuaded to carry a little package for him. Speed was of the essence, obviously. So we had to get it to the airport. He got aboard a flight leaving very soon for Manila. He reached at Manila, and then from Manila was sent by radio to New York. And the next day, he was splashed in the news all over the world. President Kennedy, the president of USA at that time, in the morning he was shown the newspaper, and he exclaimed, "Jesus Christ." And he went on to say, "No news picture in history has generated so much emotion around the world." But you have another lady, Madame Godinou. Who is this Madame Godinou? The husband is Godinou. Okay, the husband is Godinou, but people address her as Madame Godinou. Godinou is the wife of Madame Godinou is the wife of Godinou, and Godinou is the brother of Godinou. Okay, the head of the secret agency. This is a very evil woman. Despite all these things, she said, I would clap hands at seeing another monk barbecue. And her remarks make things even worse. By the way, she was the first Vietnamese to wear a Vietnamese dress with a collarless. Vietnamese dress usually with a collar. She was the first to wear a collarless and was not very acceptable to the communists at that time. But nowadays, there's no issue. Madame Gondinu was known as the Tiger Woman in Vietnam. She is referred to as the First Lady, even though she is not actually the First Lady because the President Ngotin Diam is not married. And Ngotin Diam, Gondinu, and the wife Madame Gondinu, they all stay in the same palace. According to a historian, Howard Jones, the comments made by her all but put the finishing touch on the Diam's regime. And Madame Gondinu's father, Madame Gondinu, by the way, also from a very powerful family. The parents, the father was an ambassador to the USA, and the mother an observer to the United Nations. And her own father went on to radio to condemn her comments. Her conclusions, Jones said that the regime had alienated the strongest moral forces, implying that they had lost the mandate of heaven. The Chinese called Tianyi. He had lost the mandate of the heaven. And this daughter, Madame Ngotin Du, responded by calling her father a coward. Then her mother, who was an observer at the United Nations, said that there's an old proverb in my country which means one should not make out oneself or one's family naked before the world. I was sick. Now nobody can stop her. She never listened to her advice. So this is the monk called Sik Quang Duc. Okay? He actually is quite a famous monk also in Vietnam during that time. He built quite a number of temples, and he went around the country preaching the Dharma. So he was not just an ordinary monk. So the letters left behind by Sik Quang Duc, he left a letter to let people know why he did that. Before closing my eyes and moving towards the vision of the Buddha, I respectfully plead to President Ngotin Diam to have a mind of compassion towards the people of the nation and implement religious equality to maintain the strength of the homeland eternally. You can see from his words here, there's no malice, no hatred, but just to plead to the president to have a compassionate mind towards the people of Vietnam. I call on the venerables, members of the Sangha and the lay Buddhists to organize in solidarity and to make sacrifices to protect Buddhism. An author later described that the intention of Sik Quang Duc was to benefit Vietnamese Buddhists. He actually, in his letter, envisioned his body burning like a lamp shining into darkness, which would lead those that were lost to shore. As his body burned, the smoke, like the fragrance of burning joss sticks, would bring calmness and inform those who were ignorant of the Diam's regimes of repressions of Buddhism. So his intention was to, through his actions of immolution, to bring the attention of the world to the repression of Buddhism in Vietnam. And once his body stopped burning, the ash, Sik Quang Duc imagined, would fill the gap of inequality between Buddhism and Catholicism. After burning, everything else was burned except his heart. Probably because the heart contains a lot of blood. So his heart was not burned. And his heart is kept until today. And the people of Vietnam worship this heart call it the Bodhisattva hut. Today you have a monument in memory of him built in the year 1920. So Thich Nhat Hanh, 1963 is also the year he came back to Vietnam. He commented, that's why Thich Nhat Hanh is a good propagandist for Buddhists. He commented, it was a political act calling attention to all the injustices being perpetrated against the South Vietnamese people by the government of Euro-American imperialism. And people say it's a suicide, but it is not a suicide. It is not even a protest. What the monks said in the letters they left before burning themselves. You see, when Thich Nhat Hanh used plural here because this was the first monk, but subsequently there were many other monks who did the same to call attention to the world. What the monks said in the letters they left before burning themselves aimed only at alarming and moving the hearts of the oppressors and at calling the attention of the world to the suffering then endured by the Vietnamese. To burn oneself by fire is to prove that one is saying is of the utmost importance. And referring to Sik Quang Tuk, the Vietnamese monk, by burning himself, says with all his strength and determination that he can endure the greatest of sufferings to protect his people. To express will by burning oneself, therefore, is not to commit an act of destruction, but to perform an act of construction. That is to suffer and to die for the sake of one's people. This is not suicide. So after the 11th June 1963 incident, what happened? Eventually, on the 16th of June, a joint communique was signed between the Buddhist group and the government, but Tian had no intention to honor it. In fact, continued to suppress Buddhism, and all the 5-point demands were not met. So on 21st August, as things there was no positive response from the Tian's regime, the demonstrations continued. There were a few more demolitions. So on the 21st of August, June, July, August, about 2 months later, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, attacked pagodas across Vietnam. All over Vietnam, they attacked all the temples, and at least 30 people died. Unofficially, it was said to be 100 people, and 200 people died, 200 people injured. And the Bodhisattva hut kept at the Salai Pagoda on the Seri Pa, the pagoda, was took away by the army of the ARVN. And this Madame Nu, who was not very good in public relations, again remarked, "This is the happiest day of my life." To make things worse. And with that remark, her father, Pham Bong Chung, disowned her and resigned as ambassador to USA. He was then ambassador to USA, means he was a representative of the Vietnamese government. And he said, "I could not tolerate anymore to be a regime that is so cruel to its own people." And her mother also resigned from the UN as observer and disowned her. Then Madame Nu's husband, the head of the secret agency, Nu, responded to his parents-in-law while vowing to kill his father-in-law, claiming his wife would participate. He said, "I will have his head cut off. I will hang him in the center of the square and let him dangle there. And my wife, Madame Nu, will make the knot on the rope because she's proud of being a Vietnamese and she's a good patron." I think sometimes people can be so insane, you know. Nu and Madame Nu plotted to assassinate Thich Tinh Quang, the leader. I mentioned to you just now the Pattam shooting. He was a leader and he negotiated with the government. He made the 5 demands. He signed a communique, but news were leaked up that Nu and Madame Nu plotted to assassinate him. So he went into hiding in the American embassies. And just to share with you, there were actually more protests, more self-immolation, at least 5 more. At least 5 more. And then came that fateful day on the 2nd of November 1963, 5 months or 6 months after the Pattam shooting, the American backed revolution, CIA not consented, and the army of the Republic of Vietnam started a revolution and captured Martin Diem. Actually, on the first day he escaped, but they subsequently captured him and his brother. So Martin Diem and his brother, Martin Nu, both were shot dead by the army on 2nd of November 1963. It was said that the USA actually backed this action after their repeated attempts to persuade Martin Diem to soften his stance on the Buddhism failed. So that was the end of Martin Diem. But his people were still all around in the government. And in fact, Martin Diem's death, John F. Kennedy remarked, that goddamn bitch. She's talking. He was referring to Madame Nu. She's responsible for the death of that kind man. You know, it's so totally unnecessary to have that kind man die because of that bitch stuck her nose in and boil up the whole situation down there. So after the president died, then the story continues, the war continues, and the fight for Buddhist freedoms continued because many of Thiam's forces were still in the government. The government changed hands. You know, when I was in 1963, I was only 10 years old, and before that I was reading newspaper already. There were so many change of governments, almost like a daily affair, you know, that sometimes you lost track of who is the president. You know? One army would overthrow another fella. But I still could remember a few names. Wan Won Ming, and then Pan Chao Ki. They all left for USA when the Vietnamese conquered Vietnam. So we briefly introduce this man now, Thich Tinh Quang, the man who led the celebration, the Vietnamese celebration in Vesak celebration in 1963. He died only last year, about hardly a year ago. Also died at a very old age. Give him another 4 years, he will be 100 years old. So that's why I told you, it's good to become a monk. You can live long, you know. In 1937, he joined the Buddhist Study Institute of the Hui Association of the Buddhist Study and successfully completed his education in 1945. Now that shows the role played by the Buddhist studies, the Buddhist Study Institute. They produced some of these monks who eventually became leaders of the Buddhism to fight for the cause of Buddhism. In 1946, he was ordained as a Buddhist monk, and then further he studied in Sri Lanka. In 1946 to 47, for his colonial activities, he was actually jailed by France. And he was the leader who protested against Buddhist prosecution way back in 1963. And he was the one who made the 5-point demand that Diem rejected. And after Diem's death, the Diemis continued to control the government. So there were more protests, more coup, and more self-immolation. In May 1966, actually he went on a hunger strike. 1966, already 3 years after the first self-immolation. But why he need to go on a hunger strike? That was because there was still a suppression of Buddhism that continued to go on with the armed forces still in place. And because of that, he was arrested and put under house arrest. So when we are talking about Thich Quang, the monk who we were talking just now, this monk Thich Quang, we can't miss one of the self-immolation that took place in the year 1967 in Saigon. 1967. This young lady, Nhat Chit Mai, one of the 6 ordained disciples of Thich Nhat Hanh, graduate of the University of Saigon. Well-talented young lady, she was ordained as a nun by Thich Nhat Hanh, I think around 1965, when Thich Nhat Hanh set up the order of interfaith. And she also took self-immolation, self-burn herself. So you look at it, 34, 67, she was only 33 years old. And she wrote 10 messages outlining her anti-war belief and calling to an end to the Vietnam War. Now, sometimes we cannot understand how people could be so brave as to do this. But if you are in their situation, seeing daily how lives were born or killed, life became something like so worthless. Then perhaps that fear of dying would have subsided completely. Now we're back to Thich Quang. Thich Quang, as after the communists took over, he was arrested. Poor Buddhists. In the South, they were considered as communists. But to the communists, they were considered as imperialists. So they were neither here nor there, like Thich Nhat Hanh. The North doesn't want him. The North said he's an American running dog. But while Thich Nhat Hanh condemned America, but the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese or communists would say Thich Nhat Hanh is a pro-American American running dog. So same thing for this monk Thich Quang. He was against the North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese government for their Buddhist suppression. So the South Vietnamese government labeled them, suspected them to be communists. But communists did not trust them. So when the communists took over, he was put under house arrest. And so he was put under house arrest for a long time, and he was still considered a leader of the Buddhists in the South until his final death. But he was allowed to return to his home pagoda in Hue in the year 2013, 7 years ago. And last year he passed away. So human tragedies. So now I do a brief summary. The monks who led the Buddhist pagoda movement during the the monks who led the Buddhist struggle movement during the 1960s were the product of the Buddhist revival. As you saw just now from the Buddhist colleges, the Buddhist associations, the monastic school, and the changes in the practice of Vietnamese Buddhism finally produced a group of monks who were capable of remaking their religion to engage with change. These institutions also produced a new generation of lay people who could collaborate with monks to propagate the Dharma. And in the voice of violence, engagement became struggle. So I did not mention about the lay people, but there were in fact a lot of lay people, particularly university students, who supported the monks all the way in their struggle. So in those days, Each demonstration, you would have 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 people participating, mostly young lay Buddhists. We also noticed that engaged Buddhism in Vietnam was very much necessitated by the political events unfolding in Vietnam, from anti-colonial time to self-protection against Catholicism to anti-war. So a lot of political events actually compelled the Buddhists to respond. In the face of persecution, Buddhists had no choice but to fight for their own survival. They fought with the tool of non-violence in compliance with the Buddhist teachings. At first, a lot of people in the West, for that matter in the East as well, could not understand why monks should burn themselves. In a normal civilization, if you are oppressed, you would fight back and kill the other party, like what you see now with the Islamic terrorists all over the world. They would not just kill themselves, they also want to kill you. But for the Buddhists, they chose to kill themselves. Quote and unquote, kill themselves, to finish off themselves. So this is a reflection of how civilizations were different. Some of the civilizations believe an eye for an eye, but Buddhists resort to the strategy of non-violence. And in non-violence, actually, Mahatma Gandhi, the proponent of non-violence, did mention, in non-violence, there is violence. But that violence doesn't come from you. The other party could have violence. So when Gandhi was on his independence non-violence movement, there were actually a lot of violence inflicted by the West, by the British on him and his followers. But he insisted on his non-violence approach. This is in compliance with the Buddhist teachings. Engaged Buddhism in Vietnam was a history of blood and tears. Engaged Buddhists were willing to sacrifice their own lives to implore human beings to look into their own conscience. So the engaged Buddhists in Vietnam, with their lives, sacrificing their lives, to implore us human beings to look at our own conscience. This is something that unless we are spiritually advanced, we sometimes could not comprehend. And the term engaged Buddhism became popular after Thich Nhat Hanh popularized it in the West. So this is briefly the story of engaged Buddhism in Vietnam. If you compare China, sorry, I don't know whether I still have no. I'm just trying to say to briefly talk about comparing Vietnam engaged Buddhism with China's humanistic Buddhism. You will notice that there is a vast difference. Whereas Tai Chi advocated humanistic Buddhism in China, on the ground that humanistic Buddhism did not take much impact, let alone political impact. Okay? Whereas in Vietnam, because of the political background, that humanistic Buddhism became so very socially engaged that it became what we call socially engaged Buddhism or political Buddhism that involve blood and tears, that involve a lot of sacrifices of life. And you don't see this in China. So there's a big difference. So both are humanistic Buddhism, but one side you see is a very much more peaceful phenomena compared with the other side where there are a lot of blood and tears, political involvement. But all this story ended after the 1975 communists took over, and Vietnamese fled all over the world. a lot of Vietnamese, especially in the south, escaped through the sea. They landed in the shore of Malaysia on on the east coast of our country, and we were at first our Prime Minister said we will shoot them. So the whole world Buddhist community condemned our Malaysian government for saying that. So the Malaysian government quickly changed its tone and said, no, we didn't say we shoot them. We say we sue them. Sue them means we chase them away. So, but actually, finally, we accommodated the Vietnamese in an island off the east coast of Malaysia. And a lot of these Vietnamese were helped by the Vietnamese who immigrated much earlier, including Thich Nhat Hanh. He also helped them, the so-called the boat people. Okay? So today, annually, we still see Vietnamese coming back to that particular island in the east coast of Malaya to perform ancestor worship to people who died in that island. They were in that island for a while, and so some of them died there, and some of them buried there also. Okay? So this is a great human strategy, and from here we also learned that Buddhism, at a very difficult time, try to protect itself from being destroyed, but its approach was very much a self-sacrifice rather than taking the life of the oppressors. So briefly, this is what I can share with you now for Buddhism in Vietnam. We have about 7 more minutes to go. If you have any questions, we can discuss. Okay?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'll ask the question I was about to ask earlier. So the self-immolation, was it in response to the war, or was it in response to Buddhist oppression? Because I always had the impression. So the self-immolation, was it in response to the war, asking to stop the war, or was it in response to Buddhist oppression? Because I always had the impression that the self-immolation was in response to the war, to stop the war and along those lines.
The Vietnamese, just now you say Malaysians. You're not talking about Malaysians, huh?
No, I'm talking about the monk who said himself. Yes.
It is on opposing the Vietnamese, opposing the suppression of Buddhism. It's not so much about the war. About the war, they did not have to burn themselves. They did demonstrate more. They did have demonstrations or fasting to call on all parties to stop the war, but they did not go to the extent of burning themselves. To burn themselves was mainly to bring forward the message of oppression of Buddhism by the Catholic regime of Siam. All right, anybody else?
Yes, I'd like to ask, after the communists won the war, what was their approach as far as the Buddhists?
Okay.
After the communists won the war, what was their attitude? What was their attitude toward the Buddhist? Was it still suppressed or not?
In fact, after the war, we are talking about in Vietnam. Similarly, in China, in Vietnam, after the war, the communists are basically atheists.
Yeah.
They don't believe in any religion. They are not supportive of any religions, and that attitude actually continue until today. But with the opening up of the world, with globalizations, with Western investment going into Vietnam now, they are now much more open. And that was the reason why Thich Nhat Hanh finally decided to go back. So today's situation is very much different. Only a few years back, about 3 or 4 years back, the United Nations Day of Vesak celebration was held in Vietnam, in near Hanoi, and I was there. And people from all over the world came back, including many Vietnamese who had run away during the communist regimes. Vietnamese who had migrated to USA, Australia, they also came back and participated in that forum. So now the situation is much better now, and healing, I would say healing is going on. So the old wounds are healing. Okay.
Thank you.
It is the same situation in China. Immediately after the communists took over in 1949, there was widespread fear by the religious groups that they would enjoy no more religious freedom. And in fact, that was also so. The government was concentrating on making an atomic bomb, strengthening its military strength, trying to build its economy. So the government actually did not allow so much religious freedom. So some temples continue to survive, but not growing or not developing. Then it was only after the opening up of China during Deng Xiaoping's time, then we begin to see a flourishing of Buddhist temples all over China. And today, in fact, the temples built in China, I think you can find the most number of temples built in China now. And if you look at the globe today, the whole world today, most number of temples are built in China, and they are usually huge temples like university campuses. So the scenario has changed completely. There's much more religious, much better religious freedom now in China, and even for that matter, mosques and Christian churches. To get a better observation or comment, you can read articles by the Diplomat, where they mention that actually the number of churches, temples, mosques in China all have grown in numbers, and in fact, a lot of them are much bigger than what we expect. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we meet again. When?
11 a.m. tomorrow.
6:30 tomorrow.
Oh, 6:30. You changed it on me, Corey. You're trying to exclude me, aren't you?
No, it's this way forever except for one day. So I think, yeah, the 21st is the only day that it's going to be weird. But
Okay.
since the time change, we have
Tomorrow
switched.
6:30.
I got it.
Tomorrow 6:30. Yes.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
Tomorrow
Thanks,
I don't.
Sato.
Tomorrow in my timetable here is 7 to 10 p.m.
That is your PM hour tomorrow. We are nighttime now.
Tomorrow is what day? Sunday?
Yes.
Yes.
Your place.
No, our place, yes, tomorrow is Sunday. Sunday morning.